So what does it mean to be Austrian, obviously other than, putting on the Lederhosen, eating the schnitzel and going for long hikes in the country? Well, we're not talking about Austrians per se, we're talking about Austrian economics, which is a very different thing because it's not actually even that big in Austria. So Austrian economics, and Steve, you can give your definition, but the way I see it, it really is, it's almost like a laissez-faire approach, isn't it? In that the world is too complicated. Economics is too complicated to try and determine anything other than having things determined by price. Price says everything. And anybody who tries to influence that price, like central banks, for example, will just complicate matters and almost certainly result in a misallocation of resources. So pure and simple, price is the determinant of how things are bought and sold. Is that pretty much it? How's that for a start?
Yeah. I mean, you could almost say the same thing about neoclassical. So if you want to distinguish the neoclassical paradigm from the Austrian, and they're very, very similar, the main things are twofold. And that is that neoclassicals, and you can see this in a Twitter debate right now, they reason always in equilibrium terms. There's a whole swathe of neoclassicals have suddenly turned up on Twitter to defend conventional macroeconomics, and that's all based on the idea of the market system reaching equilibrium. And every second word in a neoclassical statement is equilibrium. Austrians, every third word is equilibrium, and the one beforehand is almost equilibrium. So what the Austrians argue is that yes, capitalism tends towards equilibrium, and that's the halcyon state. But the innovations that make capitalism grow come out of being slightly away from equilibrium, in which case an entrepreneur can see an arbitrage advantage, and whether that's buying cheap and selling dear somewhere else, or whether it's coming up with a new form of technology that displaces existing technologies, and that's where Schumpeter, who is Austrian but is not an Austrian economist, overlaps with them. And that in itself is one reason that I prefer the Austrian perspective to the neoclassical, because the neoclassical really has no decent explanation of why innovation occurs in a capitalist economy, because of this emphasis upon equilibrium and marginal cost.
So,
Yeah. So the
right,
Austrians at
okay.
least say we're slightly away from equilibrium, and that's part of where the dynamism of capitalism comes from.
So equilibrium being what? What's in equilibrium? What is
Oh, please
what's
don't ask
finely
us to
balanced?
specify. You should know.
Um,
No,
um,
it's basically.
we
I mean,
all
like
want to be on the same page here.
if you go back to when the Austrians, I mean, Austrian economics is related to Karl Menger, who was one of the three
Hmm.
people who in the 1870s basically overthrew the previous classical school of economics, David Ricardo up to Hume, from Smith up to Hume fundamentally, and and they all argue that cost of production is what set price, and that they downplayed the importance of utility in that sense. Um, Whereas the Austrians and the neoclassicals say, well, capitalism enables consumers to maximize their utility by equating the marginal cost of whatever they're buying to their marginal utility, and therefore you get both cost of production and utility of the buyer involved in setting both price and quantity. Uh, and so that's the framework. The three main characters at that stage were Menger in Austria, uh, Volra in France, and Jevons in the UK. And the Jevons fundamentally gave rise to the Marshallian approach to economics. Volra gave rise to the general equilibrium approach, where you argue that all you can have an auction taking place where all goods are sold in one room by setting up a vector of prices, and you slowly grope towards equilibrium. So the vision that and so that was Volra was so the atonement, as it was called, which literally means groping for a equilibrium for a multiple number of markets at once. Jevons was more about how utility of buyers in the aggregate in a single market, and the profit maximizing drive of firms in a single market leads to an equilibrium in a single market. So that the supply and demand analysis you can basically trace back to Jevons. Multiple markets is Volra. Now, what Menger fundamentally said is, well, you won't actually reach the equilibrium. Okay? If you do, or you'll get disturbed away. And therefore, it's the non-equilibrium things that give you the dynamism of capitalism. So that, and I think that's quite a reasonable perspective. I have a totally different approach to economics, but the argument that innovation is an essential part of capitalism is unarguable. But the neoclassicals still haven't got a decent explanation of it, whereas the Austrians talk about this divergence from where you are and where the equilibrium is, and therefore there's an arbitrage opportunity, and the entrepreneur fills that gap, and that's what leads to change in capitalism. So that side of them I quite like, but it's the you can introspectively work out everything. You do not do research. You'd already know. And that's the side of Austrian that I think it's cuckoo land. And I think Austrians invented the cuckoo clock too, didn't they?
They did, and they knew how much it should sell for. The as well, because the market would decide. But this whole thing about not reaching equilibrium. I mean, we talked a little bit about and how there's a fundamental imbalance. We talked a little bit about that the other week when we were talking about AI and how we've got this massive investment, everyone putting money into AI. And there's going to be overinvestment. And we obviously, for any new innovation, tautology there, for any innovation where people are putting money in, everyone is going to assume that they're going to get more market share than they do. So fundamentally, that's an imbalance, isn't it? There's going to be, you're going to oversupply for the demand because everyone's assuming they're going to do better than they really are ultimately.
Yeah, I mean and that is something that we should actually be including. Have we analysed capitalism? That should be part of how the analysis goes. This fact that and Schumpeter. I mean, Austrians will already be annoyed because they're talking about Schumpeter, because he's an Austrian that Austrians disown. Okay, so it's a bit weird, but
what don't they like about him?
Well, first of all, he's a minister in a government. That's a pretty big mark against him. Secondly, he argues for the endogeneity of money. So one distinguishing feature, the Austrians have whatever else their attitudes, I think they're naive on banking, because what they fundamentally do is they believe that banks create money by fractional reserve, and fractional reserve is fraud because you lend out money you haven't got. Okay. And so their argument is we really need to go to a hard currency. They're very much fans of gold as the form of money, and they want banks to be banned from creating money. Now, yes, it's feasible to set up a system in which that happens. You could redefine what banking is and give banks an account out of which they lend from the Federal Reserve, etc., etc. But the Austrian perspective is really basically saying double entry bookkeeping is communism. I mean, okay, that's going to annoy another few thousand Austrians, but the basic argument.
Quite a few accountants.
Sorry?
And quite a few accountants.
Yeah, well, I think accountants. I'm saying the Austrians are garbage. Okay, take it easy. I'm on your side. But the basic argument is that banking, fractional reserve banking is fraud. Therefore, we need to ban fraud. And I honestly can't say that I've seen any Austrian proposals about how one does that using double entry bookkeeping, but they basically are against banking. They call fractional reserve banking a result of the government rather than a result of accounting.
So, and they'll be very shocked then to hear it's not even fractional reserve banking, because the banks can.
That's what I know. A lot of them are saying fractional reserve banking is itself as a myth. So in some ways they're reacting to a myth about how money is created and saying that's really bad. And I agree, it'd be really bad if that happened, but it doesn't, because it can't unless all loans are in cash. So that's how I make a couple of neoclassicals really happy, like George Selgin and so on.
What they're objecting to, though, is the idea that banks are creating money. I mean, whether it's through fractional reserve banking but we know credit creation comes from banks, which however you believe it happens and to what extent. I mean, there's general agreement, I think, that commercial banks do add money to the money supply.
That is still the disputed topic in economics. It drives me balmy that it is, because it's ridiculous.
Well, let's assume that most people think that. I mean, I think even banks believe that. Well, banks do, because they do it.
People that haven't an lobotomy by doing an economics degree, yeah.
Right, okay. So, but if the Austrians believe that that's wrong, that banks shouldn't be able to create credit, And then they are with the Bitcoiners and with the gold people in saying that there should be a finite supply of money in circulation, and yet you've got an economy that's growing. You need more money to cope with that growing economy. How do they counter that?
Well, they basically say that price adjustments should handle everything, and therefore, if you have an increasing amount of physical output, then prices should fall over time.
Right.
Okay, so they argue in favour. They probably put it that way. I mean, I haven't, I've got to admit, I read Hayek and I read Mises back at university, and in about 40 odd pages, I thought I've got something better to do with my time than read this. I'll have to one of these days go back and slog through the whole of Mises and the whole of Hayek. Um, and there are some elements of Hayek that I quite like, because Hayek actually has, this is one little fact that comes out of a good friend of mine. I've lost touch with him, but he's a brilliant scholar, Chris Sciabra, who's at New York University. Chris wrote a brilliant book called Marx, Hayek and Utopia. And he pointed out that Hayek and Marx both, in a sense, shared a education that involved dialectics. So there's a sense to which Hayek has the same concepts as Marx in terms of a philosophy of dialectics, but that is manifest in a very, very different theory. So, there are elements of Hayek that I quite like. He talked about complexity, for example, without understanding it, but that's not his fault, because when he wrote about complexity, it was before we discovered complex systems, which you can date from 1963. So he got his Nobel Prize before then, and his Nobel speech says that you can't model capitalism because it's a complex system. But what he meant by complex was complicated. And then what we've learned from complex systems is that incredibly simple systems can be complex if they have nonlinear interactions between different variables in the system. So if you have wages, which is a variable, times the number of workers who are hired, which is a variable, you've got a nonlinearity. That's fundamental. There's many like that in capitalism, and that will give you complex behavior without being complicated in the first instance. But that realization that complexity is a major issue for analyzing systems like capitalism is a mark in Hayek's favor. But the main thing that drives me balmy about them is they believe you can actually work all this out from introspection, what they call praxeology. And I believe you have a definition for me.
Well, I don't know if I've got the textbook definition, but I mean it is basically humans act purposefully, and so you can by people working on self-interest, you can determine what they're going to behave, how they're going to behave. So so basically the definition is just the science of human action. I think is if you look it up in a dictionary. So science is going to determine what you do. What you do today. You've got no free will, Steve.
No. I think I disagree with that angle on it. I think what they mean is that you can look inside yourself and understand the capitalist economy, introspection, rather than
behavioral.
Any Austrians get annoyed about that, drop us a line on the podcast or the YouTube channel. But they basically believe you don't have to do empirical research because you already know if you look inside yourself. And I when I was discussing this yesterday with Peter McCormack, I said, look, I can handle that sort of as a attempt to explain how people consume, but I want to know how you can introspectively work at how a factory functions. And that to me is the weakness in the Austrian perspective, that this idea they call praxeology, that you can deduce the nature of capitalism. You don't have to induce it by looking at actual data. And the trouble is, you can sort of get away with believing you can actually introspectively work out what you do when you consume, but you cannot introspectively work out what a factory does, because terribly sorry to tell you this, you're not a factory. So you can't actually look inside yourself and see a factory.
Okay. Well, whether it's either that inward approach or that sort of like more external approach of, well, we can tell how people are going to behave, it's the same thing, isn't it? It's saying the system is so complicated, we don't need to worry about it because price will sort it out. Price will dictate. So if you take that example of how, if production is increased, but the money supply is staying the same, prices will go down. And it it does for some things. So I was looking at on my Facebook feed the other day. I got an ad for an old ad from the 1970s, I think it was, from Granada TV rentals, with a very catchy jingle: "Great service, great sets. That's what you get from Granada." And this is in the days when great service, great service, great sets. That's what you get from Granada. And anyone who grew up in England in the 1970s will remember that TV ad, because in those days you used to rent your TV.
Used to rent your TV?
The reason, yes, because particularly when colour TV came around, and then black and white TVs became a price you could afford. Okay. But in today's prices, the cost of a TV was about $5,000. So in today's money, so you'd rent your TV. But TVs now, obviously, you can get them for a few £100. So there's an example of something that has gone down markedly in price over the years. So you could say, well, okay, so we need less money now to buy stuff like that. So you could call it deflation for that particular product, but that's been a good thing for people because it's meant we've got more money to spend on other things. But then if everything goes down because you've got an oversupply based on the amount that people have got to pay, then everything collectively has to come down in price, and obviously that's not good. That's what we saw in Japan, for example. You start to get deflation. Businesses can't grow because they think, okay, we can't sell as much because there's less money in people's pockets, and that's not a good situation, is it?
Well, I mean, this is the classic problem about when you include debt, private debt, in your model and analysis of capitalism, because there is a bias in favour of deflation in the Austrian attitude. Money should be a fixed supply. You want to have increased production, so therefore the price per unit has to fall, and that seems desirable. But once you include the reality that if you're going to operate as a capitalist firm and invest, unless you do it entirely out of cash flow, and that therefore effectively rules out entrepreneurs. One of the brilliant things that Schumpeter did when he defined an entrepreneur as somebody with an idea which could be commercially successful but no money to put it into operation. Therefore, he has to borrow money from a bank to be able to turn that idea into a product. I'm a great fan of Schumpeter, so this is going to be a bit of a Schumpeter flavored perspective on Austrian economics.
Right, and he would be defined as an Austrian economist.
Evolutionary. Now the point, and this is again, there are elements. Economics is defined by schisms. Genuine sciences develop normally a dominant paradigm, which is developed over time in what Kuhn called normal science, when the paradigm is a new way of explaining reality when it starts, and then you extend the range of things to which you apply the paradigm, because the paradigm itself will suggest what you should test. And then the paradigm, the predictions of the paradigm are confirmed, so the paradigm expands. And then you get to the point where the paradigm starts to break down, because there are, no paradigm is going to be a complete explanation of reality. So, like for example, when you look in terms of physics, and that's the dominant paradigm. We had Maxwell's ideas, one of the most brilliant physicists ever, but his paradigm basically had energy be continuous in waves. And then to explain light being transferred from the sun to the earth, you had to say there had to be a medium through which those waves passed, because waves are a compression and decompression of a medium. That's what a wave is. And therefore there had to be the ether, and they found the ether didn't exist, which led to relativity. You get this tendency for sciences. I'm losing my train of thought.
I know. I'm going to go back to the question: How does Schumpeter differ from mainstream Austrian economics?
Because Schumpeter was in the 19th century. Of course, that's when Darwin's theory of evolution was put forward. There was that post-dated to some extent the development of neoclassical economics, and certainly its acceptance post-dated the development of neoclassical economics. So a lot of the neoclassical stuff was anti-evolutionary. Equilibrium, in my opinion, defines a non-evolving system. Now, so the Austrians are sort of when they say we're out of equilibrium, then you allow a certain amount of evolutionary behavior to occur. And what Schumpeter did was include that in how a capitalist economy can cause products to evolve over time. So a major part of his argument was, how do we get new ideas? And he said, and this has gone from Austrian to Schumpeter, which Austrians to an Austrian, which frankly I prefer this
Right.
guy
We'll
over
go back, don't we? But yeah,
okay.
finish off with him.
So
Yeah.
his argument was that in equilibrium there is no profit. Okay? And if you look at the neoclassical theory and you imagine a capitalist hiring workers and hiring machinery, then if you're paying the marginal product for labor and the marginal product for machinery, then that basically eliminates the revenue you get in equilibrium. So there's no economic profit. There might be an accounting profit, as the neoclassicals talk about it, but there won't be an economic profit. You'll just make the same return as everybody else. If you want to get a higher return, you've got to disrupt that production system. So you come up with a new product or a new way of making an existing product, and under 6 conditions, you will therefore become profitable. But what that gave you was cycles in capitalism, and that's again something that Schumpeter explained it in terms of the volume of money, whereas the Austrians talk about the price of money and there being a natural rate of interest that brings everything back into, close to equilibrium, and all the cycles are caused by the rate of interest being too low or too high.
Yes.
So they could say, let the market set the rate of interest, don't let the bank's central bank, and then you get equilibrium. Schumpeter argued you're going to get cycles because it's the volume of money being created by the banking sector for entrepreneurs that enables innovation to occur. And then in that situation, if you have borrowed money, you are in debt, you are paying interest on that debt, and you accumulate that interest charge well before you actually get the revenue to pay the interest, if you're an entrepreneur in that perspective. So Schumpeter realized the importance of money creation to enable capitalism to be an evolutionary system, whereas the Austrians say it should be hard money. And I think that to me, if I had to pick a fundamental weakness of the Austrian perspective, is this belief that hard money is better for capitalism than soft money, which is what we actually have.
Well, that's quite a big one, isn't it? Because put simply, if you've got perfect competition for any product, if it's totally perfect competition, the product's the same for everybody and everyone's competing to the highest level, no one will make any money out of that situation. And the only way to get out of that situation is to say, well, okay, we need to innovate. And you can't innovate if there's no extra money around for people for you to invest. Yeah. So, the Austrians don't have an answer to that.
Well, yeah, in some sense, the only way Austrian economics and neoclassical economics works for that is that there's no private debt.
Yeah,
because it's even in Schumpeter spoke about a boom and bust cycle caused by the actions of entrepreneurs. So he starts with the idea that a capitalist is somebody with an entrepreneur is somebody with a great idea, or potentially a great idea. There'll be some bad ones, but a great idea, but no money. So therefore, to be able to become a capitalist as well as an entrepreneur, they have to borrow money. When they borrow money, they then spend that to hire workers and machines away from existing activities, because again, to make it harder for himself, he assumed that innovation is always done by new companies, and of course in the real world it's done by existing ones as well. But if you're going to get change, rather than getting like a feudal monopoly, if you're going to get genuine change, it has to be people who aren't currently successful businesses who become new ones. And Bill Gates was not a successful business when he began Microsoft. Okay? So you've got to come out of nowhere, and then to come out of nowhere, you've got to be funded to do it. That therefore means the volume of money created to an entrepreneur is part of what causes the ups and down cycles. Because you get the money, you spend it, you hire workers and machinery away from existing industries. Therefore, you cause a boom because you're paying workers more than they got paid to work in the factory, then to get them to work in your new factory, and equally for the machinery. So you cause a boom, and then when your product is produced and you start selling it, you cause a slump. So you saw this boom slump cycle. But what he left out is what happens with the amount of debt you've taken on. Does it accumulate or does it run down? And Minsky, who was one of Schumpeter's PhD students, did that effectively and said, well, what if you accumulate more debt during a boom than you can repay during the slump? What's going to happen to the aggregate level of private debt, and will that cause a crisis in the future? Which he argued it would, and that's what we call Minsky moments these days. So that accumulation of debt is left out of the Austrian perspective, including out of Schumpeter's. And that to me,
Well,
once you've got private debt, the idea that you can, have deflation when you've got private debt, that's going to trap you in potentially a debt deflation, which I think is left out of Austrian thinking.
well, presumably the Austrians believe that if you had an idea and you wanted to develop a product, you would get a loan from somebody else, from money
Yeah,
that's already
I
in
mean,
circulation.
and that's it. And then they come across to a rather than endogenous the bank system creating money. They say if you want to get, you've got to attract people to give you their money. So it's effectively a loanable funds foundation. If you're going to debt in that model is going to be loanable funds, and then loanable funds does not create money, so therefore you don't get you get the debt, but you don't get the creation of money at the same time. And they basically, well, you can pay the debt up, you can pay it down, and they basically don't focus on the importance of private debt. That's something which is definitely Minsky and Fisher and myself on the post-Keynesian tradition, but not the Austrian.
Right, but there'd be a lot of people saying, well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with if someone's got a great idea and somebody's got money, why do we have to create money to support that idea if people have got money sitting in their bank?
And then what you take is you actually have that money, you've got to be unable to spend it yourself. And I have certain experience with that. I don't want to repeat it. So there are, the idea that it can be done easily by individuals lending out the cash they've got means individuals have to have sufficient spare cash to be able to do it, and that then ends up with a class basis for being able to be a capitalist. If you've got money, you can make money. If you haven't got money, you're excluded. And I think that's the sort of stuff that appealed to a German. His name may have been Karl.
Yeah, well, there we are. I mean, exactly. And I want to talk about libertarianism and how that relates to the Austrian school as well. We'll do that when we come back after the break. But also marginal utility. We haven't really explored that very much. And I've got sort of mixed feelings on this. So I'd be interested in your take on all of that as well. Because I'm not sure we exactly see eye to eye. But let's see when we come back on the Debunking Economics podcast. So we are talking about Austrian economics, well, and bits around it.
We're not paying a great deal of attention to them, frankly, and they're going to be annoyed. See, I'm upset about that.
So one of their theories relates to marginal utility, so or just utility generally. So the great question about we all need water to survive. We don't need gold to survive, but water costs very little and gold costs a fortune. So why wouldn't actually, if it's based on what we need, why wouldn't water be very expensive and gold's a bit useless? So why wouldn't it be very cheap? And it's because what we are prepared to pay, and what we're prepared to pay is based on our perceived value. I mean, there's lots of water to go around. There's not very much gold, so we
Hold your breath
perceive
on
gold.
That one. Things aren't looking too good in the future of water at the moment.
On the waterfront, yeah, and we're
on the waterfront.
and
we should do that. Yeah. That's a good title for one of the podcasts, on the waterfront. Yeah,
on the waterfront. Yeah. So yes, but anyway, marginal utility. So and the idea behind that is if you can spend a bit of money to create something that has greater value to people than you're spending, then you get a bigger profit coming out of that. And that is the way companies operate. So what's wrong with that theory?
Marginal utility, this is actually one of the best sections of Marx, which of course most people haven't read. But Marx goes through, because the marginal utility theory isn't just the utility of the buyer, it also includes the utility of the seller. Okay. So you get exchanges in equilibrium, and this is fundamental old-fashioned neoclassical, back when the days of Jevons, before all this dynamic stochastic bullshit became dominant. Sorry, I meant to say general equilibrium. Bullshit's an easy summary of that. But Marx made the point that when you first have exchanges between cultures that, the two tribes fundamentally, so the two tribes meet and one tribe can make something the other tribe can't, then in that situation, the tribe that is doing a trade. My favorite example actually comes from Clan of the Cave Bear. You ever read that book?
No.
Okay. The first 5 volumes are great. Well, the 6th I threw in the garbage bin. Okay, so
I think that's why I didn't read it, because I found it came in 6 volumes.
You're disappointing the final section. Yeah, fair enough. You're very wise.
Well, don't justify anything that comes in 6 volumes. It's like it seems a bit like reading an Encyclopedia Britannica from cover to cover.
It's actually not. It's a anthropologically reasonable fictional account of the development of Cro-Magnon civilizations at the time of the end of the last ice age, and And what she has in that is that one tribe works out how to make pottery. And that's
Hmm.
because you literally drop some clay in and it gets fired with carbon in a fireplace and suddenly it's hard. So you realize you can actually use that. So an accidental discovery how to make pottery. And then another tribe made white leather. And that was another accidental discovery because a woman pissed on leather and the color on animal hide and the color disappeared. So and then you make these beautiful white cloth one tribe makes, and other tribes got these fabulous objects they can store food and water and drink in. And so when they meet up, you've got to give away cloth that you are currently wearing. You've got to give away pots that you're currently using. So the fall in the utility of the seller is also, and the rise in the utility of the buyer are both involved in setting the price. So Marx said that in primitive exchanges, when you have one culture abutting against another, where neither knows how the other makes the unique product that they use in trade, then yes, the marginal utility of the buyer and the seller are going to be involved in setting the price. But he said
Yeah,
after a
and they have a
while,
transaction. I have a transaction where they both win as a result.
yeah, but what you get it coming out of time is that once it becomes routine that these exchanges occur, each culture, because the white leather making culture wants the pots and the pot making culture wants the white leather, they start to produce these white leather and pots surplus to their own needs, and therefore that's what they
Hmm.
trade. And he said in that situation, the cost of production becomes the sole determinant. And ultimately, once you have established exchange going on, the seller doesn't lose any marginal utility out of selling something. Now, when you think about how with the neoclassical and Austrian idea that marginal utility of buyer and seller is tied up in each exchange, and that's what determines price. That means that each Model Y that goes out of a factory of a Tesla factory reduces Elon Musk's utility slightly. Well, bullshit. Uh, you know,
Mm.
his utility would fall if he didn't sell them, not if he does. So in that situation, in actual developed advanced
Mm.
capitalism, the marginal utility of the seller is completely irrelevant. Okay, and then that undermines the idea about marginal utility and marginal cost coming together to set prices. You do need the ratio of marginal utilities of the buyer and seller to the ratio of marginal cost of the buyer and seller. I mean, I have to go back and check the notes that I wrote 40 years ago on this bloody topic at university, but that's the basic idea. 50 years ago, that's the basic idea. So the marginal utility having a role, according to Marx, is a sign of primitive system, pre-capitalist. And then capitalism itself does not have that. And I think Marx's arguments lay down misere in terms of the reality of involving the saying that both price and quantity is set by supply and demand, which is the Marshallian stroke Austrian attitude, is basically okay for a period of primitive commodity production, but not to developed capitalist economies.
So you're saying ultimately then that, because this is where, but I'm starting to get it now. I've always had a bit of a problem with cost plus as the way that prices are arrived at, because I've always thought, well, no, prices are determined by what people are prepared to pay. And I've always thought in my own business experience, a lot of was selling internet access,
Yeah.
that you could provide price differentials by just knowing the market and what could you add in value, which would be a low cost to you or zero cost to you, but was perceived as having greater utility to the buyer. But that's all at the edges. I guess ultimately the underlying price that we charged was driven by the underlying infrastructure, and as that got cheaper, people would expect the market to come down in price. So it was the utility that you're giving to the customer, a bit like I gave with the TV example. You're getting the same utility out of a TV now. Now it costs a few £100s than you were when it was worth £7,000 or £8,000.
More utility,
So,
frankly. No
well,
more fuzzy lines and disturbed.
yeah,
Having to hit the top of the
and more
TV
than
set to make the diodes line up properly.
exactly, and more than
Any
three
young
TV
people, we're
channels.
talking about old television sets. Okay?
And do you know what? And that was why they were rented, of course, because you didn't have to pay to fix them. When the valve needed replacing, someone would come around and do that. Yes, we're really that old, children. But yeah, so the idea that the marginal utility is what people are prepared to pay isn't really relevant, is it?
Well,
It does get down.
when you look at and this is an important division in economics, and it's still with us today. You can actually find that in Aristotle. Does utility have to have a role in setting price, or does it not? And the classical school, which starts with Ricardo, starts with Smith and reaches its peak with Ricardo. Ricardo quite explicitly says it is the cost of production which sets price, and not, as has so often been said, the interaction of supply and demand. So he was literally against, and it's quite explicitly against, supply and demand analysis. And his rationale was that the analysis of capitalism should be about the products which can be produced effectively without limit if you're willing to devote the labor and machinery necessary to produce it. Whereas if you focus on scarcity, then what you're talking about is stuff which is not reproducible. So like Picasso paintings are scarce. Um, Fine wines, statues, all these sorts of things can be scarce because they're very hard to reproduce. He said that's not the focus of capitalism. The focus of capitalism is what you can produce in a factory, and they can outspend. So long as you're willing to put the resources in, you can produce the quantity. There's no scarcity does not determine the quantity you can sell in that setting. So he came to saying it's a cost of production, and he didn't actually work out Ricardo did not work out how profit was created. Neither did Smith. Marx did that. But again, it came to saying that cost of production sets price, and effectively, if you talk about demand, it sets the quantity that's purchased. Okay? So you do separate the two, rather than the two scissors, which is the way that Marshall described it in his supply and demand alike blades of a scissor. You can't say the upper or lower blade does the cutting; they both do somehow. And so I mean, Marshall's thinking supply and demand sets price and quantity. In the classical approach, the idea was that cost of production sets price, and uh, and uh, demand sets quantity.
And that, and I can see that makes sense now because, as I say, going back to my internet thinking, the cost of providing that, the infrastructure cost, comes down. Is set short term. Hopefully, comes down over time as you get economies of scale and developments in technology. And in a competitive world, you can try and create a product that's got a bit more value than your competitors. But in reality, your competitors are going to drive the price down collectively to the point where it gets down to the cost with, whatever's seen as an acceptable margin for everyone to take. And as we've said earlier,
cost plus margin,
yeah. You get to the point where that margin is going to get squeezed until somebody can actually say, well, okay, we've got something else to offer. Otherwise, as we've said, you get down to the point where perfect competition creates no profit.
And that's where being a non-equilibrium approach gives you the potential to explain how products evolve over time in a capitalist economy. Equilibrium, to assume equilibrium, nothing. Well, things change in proportion in equilibrium if you have a dynamic vision of what it means, but there is no pressure to change. For an equilibrium, why change? Whereas the real situation of industry is massive disequilibrium, and you therefore, with if you can expand your sales, you eat into your rivals. That gives you evolutionary advantages. So the competition, you don't reach this point where price equals marginal cost at all. And this is again empirical research, which Austrians refuse to do. Okay, so they're never going to accept it in the first instance. But when you do empirical research into the cost structure of firms, you find they have constant to slightly falling as volume increases, variable cost of production per unit, necessarily a rectangular hyperbola for fixed costs, which fall as each unit increases, each extra unit reduces fixed cost per unit. And therefore what you get is a huge gap between price and your cost. You do never reach the point where in the neoclassical vision, the rate of change of profit is maximized where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. In the real world, that's the rate of change of profit is always positive. It's price minus variable cost, which is greater than zero. So you don't ever get that equilibrium point, and that then gives you an evolutionary pressure for change, because if your firm takes market share away from a rival, you've got more investable funds, you've got more capacity to, you know, get loans as well. Your rival has less money, less capacity to get loans. You'll get an advantage out of that size. Competitive, diversification will give you a product that beats your rivals. You get more profit. You can invest more, and what you get is this evolutionary process, which is what capitalist markets are actually about. And I don't believe that's possible to get in an Austrian or a neoclassical framework.
Right, because they are all about price is determined, I should say, by what people are prepared to pay. And if you interfere with that, for example, you interfere with the free market, then you are upsetting the apple cart as they see it. Yeah. So they see price information, the complexities of a market is too hard to, they're giving in almost. It's like if you do anything to change it, you're upsetting this model where price is determined by people's willingness to pay, which is determined by the utility that they perceive that they're going to get from the product that they're buying, and the utility that they are winning has to be more than the perceived loss of utility from the person who's doing the buy. That's why doing the selling. That's why the transaction happens. And if you interfere in that in any way, by and that means a decentralized approach, and if you try and centralize that approach, i.e. the government gets involved, then you upset that mechanism. That's pretty much what they're about, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's about the market, and even though the Austrians don't believe you stay in equilibrium, this idea of equilibrium set by rising marginal cost and falling marginal utility, intersecting supply and demand curves, that's still a reference point. So if you stop that happening, then you are disturbing the market system. It would work better if you take your intervention out of it. But again, as I said, when you look at the actual cost structure of firms and how they determine output, you are nowhere near that point in the real world. The idea that there's a supply curve and a demand curve intersecting each other is a fiction. It's as realistic as believing there are epicycles, equants, and deferents that make the planets do what they do in the sky. When you do your empirical research, and again, the Austrians prevent themselves from doing this by praxeology, you find those conditions don't even exist. So they're a fiction. And this is what irritates me about Austrians and neoclassicals. And that's why I call myself post-Keynesian, because they say, fuck the ideology. What's actually happening in the real world? Look at it. You get an inductive theory, not this idea that you can deduce everything from looking inside yourself. You can't look inside yourself and see the situation in a factory. Even if you look inside yourself and have a fictional and think you can talk about why you consume something, computationally that's in error. The computational load of, it works when you think in one or two commodities. Think in, roughly speaking, the amount of different commodities we consume over a year, even at sort of middle class levels, is a couple of hundred. And the dimensionality of that is such that you simply can't make what they call a rational decision. You can't be utility maximizing. It's just computationally impossible. So there's so many elements of them that I find, and this Austrian belief that you can't do empirical research, I think is what they see it as an advantage. I see it as a trap.
So two things I wanted to talk about with them, and I've just looked to see how long we've been talking for, which is too long now. So maybe this is a topic for another one. I mean, there's quite a lot in relation to libertarianism. I think that might be a topic in itself, actually.
Yeah, well, the libertarian and the Austrians. Anybody who's got a libertarian political attitude almost always ends up being an Austrian, favouring Austrian economics. Yeah.
And so, but maybe we can take that as a topic in itself. And then why they don't like central banks, because that is government messing. Basically, they'd see that as, because their point is, if central banks set interest rates too low, then that creates an increase in demand for goods, for which there isn't the capacity to meet that demand, and so that creates instability. So I'm not quite sure how, and so they believe interest rates should be set not by a central bank, they should just be determined by the market, presumably.
Yeah, again, it's a belief in equilibrium, but not quite. I think that's that's the distinction between them and the neoclassicals. Neoclassicals believe in the equilibrium. They've also got this batshit crazy set of models that they presume the interest rate can be adjusted to achieve equilibrium over time. That's the neoclassicals wrote themselves into the theory of economics by taking it for granted that they control central banks, so they can actually adjust the interest rate to achieve equilibrium through time. Whereas the Austrians, I think quite rightly in that case, say that's a delusion, delusion of grandeur, and they argue we're better off setting the price of money in the marketplace. To me, the idea that the interest rate can be a control mechanism in capitalism ends up ignoring the importance of uncertainty and expectations of profit in an uncertain environment, which are by far more important than the rate of interest. So just like the neoclassicals overemphasize what you can know, even though the Austrians talk about uncertainty far more intelligently than neoclassicals do, they're still fundamentally seeing the interest rate as a control mechanism, and that can only be if the future is very much like the past, which I said, he said, was it Yogi Berra who said the future ain't what it used to be? I'm more a Yogi Berra than I am an Austrian.
Right. So, look, we've got 3 podcasts out of today to follow up on, because I think we should talk about libertarianism. We should look at how interest rates are and should be determined, and we'll talk about the waterfront as well.
And hold our nose during that conversation as well if you're in the UK.
We'll drink water while talking. That'll be an interesting test.
Sure, it's
can Steve?
In the UK.
Well, no, maybe you don't want to drink in the UK. Can Steve? I think water's not too bad here. It's just in the rivers. It's a problem. The one you get out your tap, I think, is all right. But can Steve?
This guy's you're going to run out of water. The UK looks like it's going to run out of water. Though in fact, the rainfall, the UK actually seems to be on a trend of increasing amounts of rainfall. The fun one part, and they're not exactly fun at all for Iranians, but they. Looks like the Iran's going to have to move its capital from Tehran because it doesn't have water anymore. So
right.
We're facing water shortages while there's too much water being dumped by the weather, by the climate change at the same time.
Right. Rather ironic, isn't it, that a country that is just moved the letters around to get rain and they don't have enough of it. Anyway, we'll leave it there for now. Good to talk, Steve. We'll catch you next time.
Next week. Okay. Bye.